You've heard the tales, the ones that no one dares to speak of, the secrets hidden deep in the heart of cold, forgotten churches. You've walked through the halls with those who have long since passed and felt the chilling touch of their spirits reaching out from beyond. But as the cold night closes in, remember, these stories don't end here. There are more churches in this world, more towns where the forgotten still walk and the bells still toll in the silence of night. So if you ever find yourself standing before an old church on Christmas Eve with the wind howling and the snow falling thick, remember the faces of those who never left, the faces of the lost souls waiting in the dark, waiting for the next soul to join them. Thank you for joining me tonight on Mr. Terror Tales. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and always listen carefully to the whispers in the dark. It was Christmas Eve, and the air was bitterly cold, sharp enough to make the skin on your face sting with each breath. The world outside was quiet except for the howling wind that whipped through the skeletal branches of the trees. Snow fell in thick, heavy flakes, the kind that seemed to come down in slow motion, covering the ground in a blanket of ghostly white. St. Agnes Church, an old stone structure with ivy crawling up its cracked walls, stood on the edge of town. Its tall, spire-like towers pierced the sky, casting long, jagged shadows on the snow below. The church had been abandoned for years, but tonight it would be the scene of something terrifying. Father Martin, a young priest newly assigned to the village, stood before the altar inside the church. The air was bitterly cold, his breath puffed out in visible clouds. The thick scent of old wood and musty incense filled the vast, dark space. The pews creaked under the weight of time and neglect, and the old stained glass windows above cast distorted, colored shapes on the floor. The church was almost too silent, like the entire world had been muffled by the deepening night. As he began preparing for the midnight mass, a strange sound caught his attention: the bells. Though no one had been inside for hours, the faint ringing of the bells drifted down from the tower. At first, Father Martin dismissed it. Perhaps it was the wind or the creaking of the old church, but the sound grew louder, clearer, and more insistent, echoing off the walls with an unsettling urgency. Suddenly, the temperature dropped even further, the cold seeping into his bones. His eyes widened in disbelief as the ringing grew deafening, so loud that the very floor beneath him began to tremble. It was as if the bells were tolling not for Christmas, but for something darker, something waiting. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A figure, a woman, sitting in one of the back pews. She was dressed in black, her long dark veil draped over her shoulders. Her skin was an unnatural shade of pale, like wax, and her eyes glowed faintly with an unnatural light. Her mouth opened, revealing sharp, blackened teeth that seemed far too large for her face. Father Martin's heart raced, his pulse thumping in his ears. He tried to move, but his feet felt frozen in place. The woman's gaze never left him as she slowly stood and glided toward the altar, her movements unnervingly smooth as though she were floating. The church grew even colder, the temperature plunging to a level that felt impossible. And then, in a voice that sounded like it came from beneath the earth itself, she whispered, "You shouldn't have come back. It's not safe." Father Martin staggered back, but before he could react, the bells ceased. A bone-chilling silence filled the church, the kind that gnawed at the edges of your sanity. The woman was gone, but the cold remained. He felt a heavy weight on his chest, as if the air itself had become thick with dread. As Father Martin turned to leave, the faintest whisper echoed in his ear, "Leave or join us." In a forgotten corner of the world, where the mountains rise high and the snow never seems to end, St. Christopher's Church stood as a monument to the past. The church was ancient, its walls worn and cracked from centuries of storms and time. But on Christmas Eve, the church was meant to be a place of light, warmth, and celebration. But this Christmas Eve would bring only darkness. The thick fog that rolled down from the mountains seemed to swallow everything in its path. The air was thick, damp, and unrelenting. No one had dared to travel far that night, except Sarah, a young woman who had just moved to the village. She had heard the rumors about the church, but she brushed them off as superstition. Little did she know she was about to step into a nightmare. The fog enveloped the church as Sarah walked through the heavy wooden doors, the cold air cutting through her coat like a blade. Inside, the church was nearly empty, the only sound the soft echo of her boots on the cold stone floor. The scent of pine needles and old wood mixed with something more unsettling, a damp, musty smell that made her uneasy. The candles flickered in their holders, casting long shadows across the worn pews. There was no one else in sight, but she could hear something, faint, almost imperceptible, the sound of a choir singing. The notes drifted in the air like smoke, winding around her and tugging at her thoughts. Sarah glanced around, confused. The church was empty, but the singing continued, growing louder. The voices were angelic, sweet and ethereal, filling every corner of the church. They seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Her heart began to race as she turned in circles, searching for the source of the sound. But then, from the choir loft, she saw them. Shadowy figures, their faces obscured by the darkness, stood at the railing. Their robes fluttered in the wind and their hands were raised as if conducting the unseen choir. Their faces were hidden beneath the hoods, but their eyes burned bright red like molten lava. Sarah felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The singing stopped abruptly, leaving only an eerie silence. Her breath caught in her throat as one of the figures moved toward her, its head tilting slowly, its glowing eyes never leaving hers. She tried to scream, but her voice was caught in her throat. Then a cold, whispering voice cut through the silence. "You're not supposed to be here." Before Sarah could react, the candles flickered out, plunging the church into darkness. She could hear the sound of footsteps, the scrape of bare feet against stone. The singing began again, louder and more distorted this time, as if the voices were no longer angelic, but something far darker. When the light returned, the choir was gone. Sarah was alone again, but the whispers lingered in the air, swirling around her like the fog outside. Black Hollow was a town forgotten by time, nestled deep in a valley where the sun seemed to disappear behind thick clouds more often than not. The old church, with its high tower and cracked bell, stood on a hill, isolated and haunting. People in town said the church was built on an ancient burial ground and strange things had been happening there for as long as anyone could remember. But on this Christmas Eve, no one would survive. The fog rolled in thick and heavy that night, blanketing the town in a suffocating silence. The cold, biting air stung like needles, cutting through layers of clothing. The clock tower struck midnight, its chimes echoing through the valley. Inside the church, the candle flames danced erratically, casting long, twisted shadows on the stone walls. Father O'Donnell stood at the altar, his face pale, his hands trembling as he tried to steady the prayer book. The air felt wrong, thick, oppressive. The scent of decay was faint but unmistakable, and a strange pressure pressed against his chest, as if something were watching him. The parishioners sat quietly, their heads bowed, their voices murmuring the familiar prayers. But something was wrong. The wind outside howled, rattling the windows, and the doors to the church slammed shut with a violent bang. The candles flickered, their flames dimming as if being suffocated by the cold. Father O'Donnell glanced around nervously. The congregation, normally so devout, seemed off. Their faces were pale, their eyes sunken like they hadn't slept in days. As he began the prayer, a loud crash erupted from the back of the church. The heavy wooden doors were torn open, and a figure stood silhouetted in the doorway. Cloaked in black, its face hidden in shadow, the figure stepped forward, dragging chains that scraped against the stone floor. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping so rapidly that their breaths were visible in the air. The figure raised its head, revealing glowing red eyes, burning like hot coals in the dark. The room filled with the sound of rustling chains and a low, guttural voice that echoed from the shadows. "You shouldn't have stayed. Now you're mine." The figure moved forward, and the candles went out one by one, plunging the church into darkness. The last thing anyone heard was the soft scrape of chains, the sound of feet dragging across the cold stone, and the deafening scream of Father O'Donnell. When the town awoke the next morning, the church stood silent, as if nothing had ever happened. But inside, the pews were empty, the air thick with the smell of decay, and the floor was stained with dark, unidentifiable marks. The bodies were gone, but the whispers still remained, carried on the cold wind. Leave before it's too late. So remember, when you find yourself near an old, isolated church on Christmas Eve, especially when the weather is dark and strange, tread carefully. The spirits that haunt those sacred halls are not at rest. If you listen closely enough, you may hear the faintest sound of bells, whispering voices, or the eerie hum of a choir. But it's already too late. The dead are waiting. You've heard the tales, the ones that no one dares to speak of, the secrets hidden deep in the heart of cold, forgotten churches. You've walked through the halls with those who have long since passed and felt the chilling touch of their spirits reaching out from beyond. But as the cold night closes in, remember, these stories don't end here. There are more churches in this world, more towns where the forgotten still walk and the bells still toll in the silence of night. So if you ever find yourself standing before an old church on Christmas Eve with the wind howling and the snow falling thick, remember the faces of those who never left, the faces of the lost souls waiting in the dark, waiting for the next soul to join them. But this is just the beginning. There are countless more terrifying tales hidden deep in the shadows, and if you've made it this far, I know you're hungry for more. So if you enjoyed tonight's chilling stories, don't just sit there in the dark. Like this video, share it with your friends, and make sure to subscribe to Mr. Terror Tales so you never miss the horrors that await in the shadows. If you like Sent to Mr. Terror's Tales, email your unique story. Help us spread these stories far and wide so more souls can hear the chilling whispers that linger in the night. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and always listen carefully to the whispers in the dark. Because who knows, one day you might hear them calling your name. Thank you for watching.